would help you to quit? If so, why?
Well, first of all, the new law that was put in place is not about me. It's about the next generation of kids coming up. So I think it's fair, Margaret, to just say that you just think it's neat to ask me about my smoking as opposed to it being relevant to my new law. But that's fine. I understand. It's an interesting human interest story. Look, I've said before that as a former smoker, I constantly struggle with it. Have I fallen off the wagon sometimes? Yes. Am I a daily smoker, a constant smoker? No. I don't do it in front of my kids. I don't do it in front of my family. And, you know, I would say that I am 95% cured. But there are times where I mess up. And I mean, I've said this before. I get this question about once every month or so. And, you know, I don't know what to tell you other than the fact that, you know, like folks who go to AA, you know, once you've gone down this path, then, you know, it's something you continually struggle with, which is precisely why the legislation we signed was so important. Because what we don't want is kids going down that path in the first place. Okay? Macarena Vidal? Yes.
Mr. President, you're meeting today with Chilean President Michelle Bachelet. You're meeting next week with Álvaro Uribe from Colombia. 2 months ago in Trinidad, in the Summit of the Americas, you said that you called on Latin American countries to help you with deeds, not words, particularly towards less democratic countries. Have you noticed any particular progress in these 2 months, and can you give us examples if so?
Well, first of all, I'm very much looking forward to seeing President Bachelet. I think she's one of the finest leaders in Latin America, a very capable person. If you look at how Chile has handled the recession, they've handled it very well, in part because the surpluses that they got when copper prices were very high, they set aside. And so they had the resources to deal with a downturn. It's a good lesson for the United States. When we had surpluses, they got dissipated. We think that there's enormous possibilities of making progress in Latin America generally. One of the things that I'll be talking about with President Bachelet is the coordination and cooperation between the United States and Chile on clean energy. We'll have an announcement when we do our press conference after my bilateral meeting on some important clean energy partnerships. We're making important progress when it comes to exchanges on cancer research. We continue to have a robust trade regime with Chile. And by the way, Chile has actually entered into some very interesting partnerships, not just with the federal government, but also with state governments like California. So I think the relationship that we have with Chile, which, by the way, does not fall in line with the U.S. foreign policy on every single issue, but it's a respectful policy. Chile is an important partner. I think that's the model that we want, partnership. The United States doesn't dictate how Chile should view its own interests, but in fact, we've achieved great cooperation. And I will be looking at President Bachelet giving us further advice in terms of how we can take the kind of relationship we have with Chile and expand that to our relationships throughout Latin America. Okay?
But my question is not only about Chile, it's about Latin American countries giving you a hand against less democratic countries.
Well, the point is that I think Chile is leading by example. So I'm using Chile as an example, but the same is true in Brazil, for example. I mean, President Lula came in, and he's got a very different political orientation than most Americans do. He came up through the trade union movement. He was perceived as a strong leftist. It turns out that he was a very practical person. who, although maintains relationships across the political spectrum in Latin America, has instituted all sorts of smart market reforms that have made Brazil prosper. And so if you take a Bachelet or a Lula, and the United States has a good working relationship with them, then I think that points the way for other countries that maybe where the democratic tradition is not as deeply embedded as we'd like it to be. And we can make common cause in showing those countries that, in fact, democracy, respect for property rights, respect for markets-based economies, rule of law, that all those things can, in fact, lead to greater prosperity. That's not just a U.S. agenda, but that's a smart way to increase the prosperity of your own people. Okay. Hans Nichols. Hans?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. If I can just return to the economy more generally. When you were selling the economic stimulus package, you talked, and your advisors and economists talked about keeping unemployment below 8%. Yet last week you acknowledged that unemployment is likely to reach double digits, being 10%. Right. Do you think you need a second stimulus package?
Well, not yet, because I think it's important to see how the economy evolves and how effective the first stimulus is. I think it's fair to say that, keep in mind, the stimulus package was the first thing we did, and we did it a couple of weeks after inauguration. At that point, nobody understood what the depths of this recession were going to look like. If you recall, it was only significantly later that we suddenly get a report that the economy had tanked. And so it's not surprising then that we missed the mark in terms of our estimates of where unemployment would go. I think it's pretty clear now that unemployment will end up going over 10% if you just look at the pattern, because of the fact that even after employers and businesses start investing again and start hiring again, typically it takes a while for that employment number to catch up with economic recovery, and we're still not at actual recovery yet. So I anticipate that this is going to be a difficult year, a difficult period.
What's the high water mark then for unemployment?
Well, I'm not suggesting that I have a crystal ball. Since you just threw back at us our last prognosis, let's not engage in another one. But what I am saying is that here are some things I know for certain. In the absence of the stimulus, I think our recession would be much worse. It would have declined without the Recovery Act. We know for a fact that states, for example, would have laid off a lot more teachers, a lot more police officers, a lot more firefighters. Every single one of those individuals whose jobs were saved as a consequence, they are still making their mortgage payments. They are still shopping. So we know that the Recovery Act has had an impact. Now, what we also know is this was the worst recession since the Great Depression. And people are going through a very tough time right now. And I don't expect them to be satisfied. I mean, one thing that, as I sometimes glance at the various news outlets represented here, I know that there's sometimes reporting of, the administration's worried about this, or their poll numbers are going down there, or this, or... Look, the American people have a right to feel like this is a tough time right now. What's incredible to me is how resilient the American people have been, and how they are still more optimistic than the facts alone would justify, because this is a tough period. And I don't feel satisfied with the progress that we've made. We've got to get our Recovery Act money out faster. We've got to make sure that the programs that we've put in place are working the way they're supposed to. I think, for example, our mortgage program has actually helped to modify mortgages for a lot of people, but it hasn't been keeping pace with all the foreclosures that are taking place. I get letters every day from people who say, I appreciate that you put out this mortgage program, but the bank is still not letting me modify my mortgage, and I'm about to lose my home. And then I've got to call my staff and team and find out, why isn't it working for these folks? And can we adjust it? Can we tweak it? Can we make it more aggressive? This is a very, very difficult process. And what I've got to do is to make sure that we're focused both on the short term, how can we provide families immediate relief and jumpstart the economy as quickly as possible, and I've got to keep my eye on the long term. And the long term is making sure that by reforming our healthcare system, by passing serious energy legislation that makes us a clean energy economy, by revamping our education system, by finally getting the financial regulatory reforms in place that are necessary for the 21st century. By doing all those things, we've got a foundation for long-term economic growth. And we don't end up having to juice up the economy artificially through the kinds of